Hello and welcome. It is evening now, the day settling into that quiet hour when the bustle fades, when thoughts turn inward, when the mind begins to slow like an old clock winding down. Perhaps you have wondered about the Great Depression, how America fell from giddy prosperity to desperate hardship, how the confident 1920s became the hungry 1930s, how the stock market crash of 1929 unravelled into a decade of unemployment and dust and breadlines, how this difficult period quietly reshaped the nation and the world, creating safety nets and regulations and economic theories that persist today. Tonight we are going to explore that story slowly, patiently, following the arc from euphoric boom through devastating crash to gradual recovery, understanding not just the economics but the human experience, the daily routines of both prosperity and poverty, the small moments that defined an era, the patient progression from confidence to despair to cautious hope. This is not a tale of drama told breathlessly. It is something quieter, more patient. It is the story of ordinary people living through extraordinary times, of how societies change, of the rhythms of boom and bust that have repeated through history, teaching lessons that each generation must relearn. If this story helps you rest tonight, feel free to like or subscribe. I am always curious where you are listening from. Comment your city and what time it is there. It creates a small connection knowing that people around the world are settling into sleep with these same stories, these same histories unfolding quietly in the darkness. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights if you have not already. Adjust your pillow so your neck rests properly. Perhaps turn on a fan for soft background noise, something that creates gentle white noise, the constant patient sound that becomes soothing through familiarity. Let the concerns of the day drift away like ticker tape falling through air. Tonight, you will journey through the 1920s and 1930s, watching how boom became bust, how prosperity vanished, how the nation struggled and eventually recovered, the patient cycles of economic history unfolding in their measured way. Imagine you are standing on a busy New York City street corner in the summer of 1926, the afternoon sun being warm on your face, the air smelling of automobile exhaust and cigarette smoke, hot asphalt and perfume from passing crowds. The street is alive with motion, with energy, with the confidence of a nation that believes itself invincible, that sees only prosperity ahead, that thinks the good times will last forever. You watch well-dressed businessmen in pressed suits and bowler hats striding purposefully, secretaries in fashionable dropped-waist dresses laughing as they walk, delivery trucks rumbling past, their horns honking, automobiles gleaming in new paint, polished chrome reflecting sunlight. The sounds are distinctive, being what 1926 sounds like. The rhythmic clatter of elevated trains passing overhead, their wheels clicking on rails, jazz music drifting from open speakeasy doors despite prohibition, the cheerful illegal melodies being what everyone knows are there, the low hum of electric trolley cars gliding past, newspaper boys calling out headlines about Lindbergh preparing for his Atlantic flight, about Babe Ruth hitting home runs, about prosperity extending as far as eyes can see, the optimism being palpable, being in the air like humidity before rain. You notice a brokerage office nearby, its large windows displaying ticker tape machines, the glass being clean, reflecting passing crowds. Inside being visible a scene of busy commerce, men clustered around the machines, watching stock prices being printed continuously on thin paper ribbons, the mechanical clicking being constant, being heartbeat of the market, being sound of money being made, or so everyone believes. The men inside are smoking cigars, laughing, slapping each other's backs, the atmosphere being celebratory, being what prosperity feels like, being confidence made visible. The smell inside, when you push through the heavy glass door, is distinctly masculine, being cigars and pipe tobacco, hair pomade and wool suits, the faint chemical tang of ticker tape ink, coffee brewing in corner percolator, the mixture being what brokerage houses smell like in 1926, being scent of American commerce, of speculation, of the belief that stocks only go up, that buying on margin is smart investing, that anyone can become rich simply by participating in the market's inevitable rise. The ticker machines themselves are mechanical marvels, being what connects this office to Wall Street miles downtown, to the exchange floor where stocks are traded, being telegraph technology adapted for continuous price updates, printing company symbols and prices on ribbon of paper, the tape emerging constantly, accumulating in piles that floorboys sweep up periodically, the discarded fortunes and losses being mere litter, being what tomorrow's newspapers will analyse, being history in the making, though nobody recognises it as such, everyone being too focused on present prices, present opportunities, present certainties about future wealth. You watch a middle-aged man in vest and shirt sleeves studying the tape, his fingers following the printed symbols, lips moving as he calculates, his face being intent, serious, the concentration being what speculation requires, being attention to detail, to patterns, to the belief that past performance predicts future returns, that understanding ticker movements reveals market secrets, that skill and knowledge matter, when really in 1926 almost any purchase makes money simply because everything rises, the tide lifting all boats, the rising market making everyone feel like genius investors. The broker himself stands behind wooden counter, his vest being unbuttoned in the summer heat, sleeves rolled to elbows, a pencil tucked behind ear, his demeanour being professional but friendly, being what customer service looks like in 1926, being personal relationship banking and investing, knowing customers by name, their families, their circumstances, being small-town atmosphere even in big city, being trust built through familiarity, through face-to-face transactions, through handshakes that seal deals. He calls out to the man studying ticker tape. "Radio Corporation, up another 3 points, Mr. Henderson. Your share's looking mighty good today." The smile on his face being genuine, being what success looks like, everyone making money, everyone winning, the zero-sum nature of markets being obscured by rising tide, by bull market that lifts all portfolios, by optimism that mistakes luck for skill, temporary boom for permanent prosperity. Mr. Henderson looks up, his own smile being satisfied, being vindicated in his investment choices, his faith in American innovation, in the belief that Radio Corporation and General Motors and all these modern companies will change the world, will create unlimited prosperity, will justify any price because future earnings will be enormous, limitless, beyond current imagination. "Excellent news," he says, voice being calm but pleased. "I think I'll buy another 100 shares on margin. If it keeps rising like this, we'll all retire rich by next year." Though 1920s investors thought stocks only go up, a phrase modern Reddit traders would recognize, though with significantly more devastating consequences and considerably less government safety net to catch them when markets inevitably corrected. The psychology being eternal, being what every bubble produces, being human nature unchanged across centuries, greed and confidence overriding caution and reason, the pattern being what historians study, what economists analyse, what repeats despite everyone knowing it repeats. Because this time feels different, always feels different, until it doesn't. The brokerage office walls are decorated with promotional posters showing gleaming automobiles, modern factories, families gathered around radios listening to broadcasts. the imagery being aspirational, being American dream made visual, being promise that technology and progress will deliver prosperity to everyone who participates in market, who invests in future, who has faith in American capitalism. The propaganda being effective because being partly true, prosperity being real even if unsustainable, improvements being genuine even if overvalued. The 1920s representing actual advancement, even as speculation runs ahead of reality. You notice a young couple entering, looking nervous but excited, the woman being perhaps 25, fashionably dressed in drop-waist dress and cloche hat, her husband in new suit that still smells of tailor shop, both being what you would call middle class, being office workers or skilled tradesmen, being people who never invested before, but now feel left out, feel foolish for not participating in market. Everyone discusses, everyone profits from being what late-stage bull markets produce, bringing in final wave of investors who buy at peak, who provide liquidity for insiders selling, who will lose most when crash comes. The broker greets them warmly, ushering them to chairs beside his desk, the furniture being heavy oak, solid, permanent seeming, the office itself being temple of capitalism, being place where American dreams are pursued, where future wealth is created through shrewd investment, or so everyone believes, the illusion being complete, being what makes system work until it stops working, confidence being foundation of financial markets, trust being what enables speculation, belief being what drives prices higher and higher until belief falters, until confidence cracks, until trust evaporates like morning dew in afternoon sun. We've been reading about the market, the young man says, his voice being eager but uncertain, being someone who wants to believe but needs reassurance, being natural caution, fighting against fear of missing out, the FOMO being powerful motivator, being what brings small investors into market at worst possible time. The timing being tragic in retrospect, though seeming smart in moment, everyone around them getting rich, everyone talking about their gains, the social pressure being enormous to participate, to be part of exciting times, to not be left behind. Excellent decision, the broker responds, his voice being encouraging, being salesman's voice though he genuinely believes what he's saying, being true believer himself, owning stock, invested in market, drinking his own Kool-Aid as later generations would say, being sincere in his optimism even if misguided, being victim of same delusion he promotes, the bubble being psychological phenomenon affecting everyone, removing critical thinking, replacing analysis with faith, substituting hope for evidence. The conversation continues, the broker explaining margin buying, how they can control $1,000 of stock for only $100 down, how if stock rises 10% they double their investment, how leverage magnifies returns, the mathematics being accurate as far as it goes, being true about upside, being silent about downside, about how leverage also magnifies losses, how 10% drop wipes out entire investment, how margin calls for selling at worst times, the risk being underplayed, being barely mentioned, being what no one wants to think about in summer of 1926. Outside the window, the city continues its busy afternoon. Delivery trucks making rounds, businessmen returning from lunch, stenographers hurrying back to offices, the rhythm being what prosperity looks like, being employment and commerce and the daily activities of functioning economy, being real even as financial markets float higher on borrowed money and unrealistic expectations, the disconnect being what will become obvious in hindsight, being invisible in moment, being what always happens when speculation divorces from underlying economic reality. You leave the brokerage office, stepping back onto the hot sidewalk, the afternoon sun being lower now, shadows being longer, the workday beginning its transition toward evening, toward that period when offices close and entertainment districts come alive, when jazz clubs open, when speakeasies begin serving illegal alcohol, when the Roaring Twenties earn their name through parties and excess, through generation that survived World War I and now celebrates peace with abandon, with determined pursuit of pleasure, with belief that they deserve good times after war's horror, the psychology being understandable even if economics are unsustainable. The street vendors are out, selling newspapers from wooden stands, the headlines being optimistic, promising continued growth, announcing new construction projects, new businesses launching, new technologies emerging, the news being uniformly positive, being what sells papers, being what readers want to hear, confirmation bias being what drives media coverage, bullish sentiment being what advertisers prefer, the fourth estate being captured by same optimism infecting everyone, critical journalism being unwelcome, skepticism being dismissed as pessimism, as failure to understand new era, new paradigm, new rules that supposedly make old patterns obsolete. You buy a paper, the newsprint being fresh, smelling of ink and pulp, the texture being slightly rough, leaving black smudges on fingers. The physical artifact being what news consumption looks like in 1926, being tangible, being ritual of reading broadsheet on train or in parlour, being different from modern instant news, being slower, more deliberate, more filtered, though not necessarily more accurate. Bias and boosterism being eternal features of journalism regardless of medium or era. The financial pages show stock listings in tiny print, columns of numbers showing opening prices, closing prices, volume traded, the data being what serious investors study, what guides their decisions, what creates illusion of rational market, of informed investing, of prices reflecting fundamental value, the reality being that numbers can be analysed infinitely without revealing future. That past performance means nothing, that markets are driven by psychology as much as economics, by confidence and fear, by greed and panic, by human emotions that no amount of data can predict or control. Time passes, you find yourself now on morning commuter train heading into Manhattan, the date being spring 1928, the car being full of businessmen in suits, hats, reading newspapers, talking quietly about stocks, about their portfolios, about tips they've heard, the atmosphere being even more excited than 1926, the bull market having continued, having accelerated, having reached phase where everyone is invested, where conversations revolve around market, where wealth accumulation seems effortless, automatic, inevitable. The man beside you is reading the financial section, his finger following ticker symbols, occasionally making notes in small leather-bound notebook, his concentration being complete, being what morning commute has become for thousands, studying stocks, planning purchases, calculating profits, the obsession being what bubbles produce, what captures attention, what seems most important thing in world, more important than work, than family, than anything except next opportunity to buy, to profit, to get richer still. General Motors, up $5, someone announces to no one in particular, the pride in his voice being obvious, being personal achievement even though he did nothing except buy and hold, the conflation of luck with skill being complete, being what bubble psychology does, making winners believe they're geniuses, making them confident enough to borrow more, buy more, risk more. The feedback loop being what drives prices higher, what creates momentum, what makes crash inevitable, even if timing remains uncertain. The train rattles through tunnel, emerging into morning sunlight, pulling into Grand Central Terminal, the vast space being marble and brass, echo and light, thousands of commuters flowing through like water, purposeful, energetic, the building itself being testament to prosperity, to belief in future, to confidence that America will continue growing, We'll need more trains, more stations, more infrastructure to support expanding economy, expanding population, expanding ambitions, the optimism being built into architecture, into urban planning, into every decision being made in late 1920s. You follow the crowd through terminal, onto street, the morning being fresh, spring air being pleasant, city being at its best. Before summer heat makes it oppressive, the season being when anything seems possible, when renewal seems natural, when optimism feels justified by evidence of nature itself, trees budding, flowers blooming, the cycle of seasons suggesting cycle of prosperity will continue equally naturally, equally inevitably, equally certainly. The office buildings tower above, their height being achievement of engineering, of steel frame construction, of elevators making vertical cities possible, practical, profitable, the skyscrapers being symbols of American power, of technological prowess, of unlimited ambition, each building trying to exceed previous record, Chrysler Building, an Empire State Building competing for title of world's tallest, the race being metaphor for economy itself, always reaching higher, never satisfied, never questioning whether limits exist, whether gravity applies to markets as well as buildings. Inside a typical office, you watch secretaries arriving, hanging coats, covering typewriters being uncovered, the morning routine beginning, the clatter of keys soon filling air, carbon paper being inserted for copies, the technology being modern, being efficient, being what makes business scalable, allows corporations to grow, to manage complexity, to coordinate operations across distances. The infrastructure of capitalism being built, being improved, being what enables economic expansion that everyone assumes will continue indefinitely. The secretaries are young women mostly, having seized opportunity that war created when men went overseas, positions becoming available, barriers falling, independence being tasted and not surrendered when peace returned, though equality remains distant, pay being lower, advancement being limited, marriage being expected to end, careers, but the 1920s representing progress. Nonetheless, slow progress, insufficient progress, but movement toward future where opportunities expand, where potential gets recognized, where talent matters more than gender, the hope being present, even if realization remains incomplete. You find yourself now inside a brokerage house in early 1928, the date being summer, the room being more crowded than 1926 office, more frantic, the speculation having intensified, having reached fever pitch, ordinary people crowding in, shoeshine boys offering stock tips between shining shoes, elevator operators discussing their portfolios, the democratization of investing being complete, everyone participating, everyone believing they can beat market, can get rich, can retire young if they just pick right stocks, buy at right time, hold long enough to see gains materialize. The ticker machines are clicking constantly now, multiple machines running simultaneously, trying to keep up with trading volume, the mechanical sound being backdrop to everything, being pulse of market, being what everyone watches, waits for, depends upon for information, for confirmation, for the numbers that validate decisions, show profits, promise more gains tomorrow, the addiction being real, being powerful, being what brings people back day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute. The smell is cigarette smoke thick in air, men smoking constantly, ashtrays overflowing, the ventilation being inadequate, windows being open but breeze being insufficient. Summer heat combining with crowd density, creating uncomfortable atmosphere, but no one complaining, no one leaving, attention being locked on ticker tape, on chalkboards being updated, on the numbers that matter more than comfort, more than health, more than anything except making money, getting rich, achieving financial success that obsesses nation. A broker shouts across room, Radio Corporation of America up 10 points. Who wants in? The enthusiasm is infectious, hands shoot up, voices call out orders, the frenzy being what late bull markets look like, being mania barely controlled, being collective delusion that this time is different, that old rules don't apply, that stocks will rise forever because economy is strong, because America is exceptional, because modern era has solved problems that plagued previous generations, the hubris being complete, being tragic in retrospect, being invisible in moment. The margin calls are being made, but only to provide more money to buy more stocks, not to cover losses. Losses being theoretical, being paper only, being irrelevant when everything rises, when selling seems foolish, when holding seems wisest strategy, when buying more seems only logical response to rising prices, the feedback loop being positive, being self-reinforcing, being what creates bubbles, what inflates them beyond reason, what makes eventual pop devastating when it comes. You notice a chalkboard on wall being updated continuously by young man with chalk, the columns showing stock prices, the numbers being written, erased, written higher, erased, written higher still, the trajectory being uniformly upward, the pattern being what confirms belief, what validates strategy, what makes skepticism seem foolish, pessimism seem stupid, caution seem cowardly, the social pressure to participate being overwhelming, the fear of missing out being stronger than fear of losing, greed being more powerful than prudence. Though economists later would identify clear warning signs, production slowing, inventories rising, construction declining, agricultural prices collapsing, international trade weakening. In summer 1928, these signals are ignored, dismissed, explained away, because markets keep rising, because everyone is making money, because admitting problems means admitting current strategy is wrong, means selling, means missing further gains. The cognitive dissonance being resolved by ignoring evidence, by trusting prices more than fundamentals, by believing what we want to believe rather than what data suggests. The conversations around you are revealing in their confidence, in their certainty, in their utter lack of doubt about future prosperity. Buy General Motors. One man advises another. Automobile is future of America. Everyone will own car, maybe 2 cars. Prices can only go up. The logic seems sound, being based on real trends, real changes, real growth in automobile ownership, the error being in assuming linear growth continues forever, in ignoring saturation, in forgetting that all markets mature, all growth slows, all expansions eventually pause or reverse, the business cycle being what it is, despite wishful thinking. Months pass, you finding yourself now in autumn 1929, the date being September, the market having reached all-time highs, prices being at levels that seem astronomical compared to just few years ago. The Dow Jones Industrial Average having quadrupled since 1924, the gains being real but unsustainable, being built partly on genuine economic growth, partly on credit expansion, partly on speculation, partly on delusion, the mixture being toxic, being unstable, being ready to collapse when confidence falters, when selling begins, when the self-reinforcing loop reverses from positive to negative. The warning signs are more obvious now, at least to those willing to see them. British economy being in recession, German economy struggling with reparations and inflation hangover, American agricultural sector being depressed for entire decade while cities boomed, industrial production showing first signs of slowing, construction declining from peak levels, but stock market continuing upward, disconnecting from underlying economy, floating on its own momentum. On belief alone, the divergence being what makes crash inevitable, even if precise timing remains unknown. Roger Babson, a relatively obscure economist, delivers speech on September 5th, predicting terrific crash coming, market dropping sharply that day before recovering, The Babson break being what pundits call it, being temporary scare, being buying opportunity for true believers, being dismissed by establishment economists, by market analysts, by everyone with vested interest in bull market continuing. The messenger being attacked rather than message being heeded, the pattern being familiar from every bubble, every mania, every period when collective delusion grips society. You stand now outside New York Stock Exchange, early morning of October 24th, 1929, Thursday, the weather being grey, overcast, autumn chill being in air, the mood being different from previous months, an unease being palpable, crowds being larger than normal, police presence being heavier, something being off, being wrong, being what participants feel without naming. The premonition being justified though few want to acknowledge it, the denial being strong, the hope being that this is temporary, that confidence will return, that everything will be fine as it always has been. The opening bell rings at 10 a.m, the sound being same as always, the bronze bell being struck, trading beginning, but immediately prices start falling, not slowly but quickly, alarmingly, the sell orders overwhelming buy orders, the balance being lost, the confidence being broken, the panic beginning, the cascade starting, each drop triggering more selling, margin calls, forcing liquidations, liquidations causing more drops, the death spiral beginning, being irreversible once started, being what every bull market ends in, when psychology shifts, when fear replaces greed, when everyone wants out simultaneously, the exit door being too narrow for crowds trying to escape. The ticker machines fall behind almost immediately, volume being unprecedented, the mechanical printers unable to keep pace, prices being delayed by minutes, then by hours, the information lag being what amplifies panic, no one knowing current prices, everyone fearing worst, selling blindly, accepting any price, the chaos being complete, the order being lost, the market mechanisms being overwhelmed by human panic, by fear that runs deeper than rational thought, by instinct to escape danger even when escape is impossible, when selling means loss, when holding might mean recovery, but fear preventing patient waiting, demanding action, requiring exit regardless of cost. Inside the exchange, the trading floor is chaos, brokers shouting themselves hoarse, waving arms, trying to execute sell orders, trying to find buyers, prices falling faster than they can process. The chalkboards being updated constantly but never current, always behind, showing yesterday's prices while today's collapse continues, the noise being deafening, hundreds of men shouting simultaneously, the sound echoing off marble walls, off high ceilings, being cacophony of fear and desperation, being what market panic sounds like, being unforgettable for those present, being trauma that shapes careers, lives, futures. The telephone banks outside the exchange are jammed, brokers trying to call clients, clients trying to call brokers, circuits being overwhelmed, operators being unable to handle volume, communication breaking down just when needed most, the isolation being what makes panic worse, inability to get information, to execute orders, to know what's happening, the uncertainty being what amplifies fear, what drives irrational decisions, what makes bad situation catastrophic. By midday, the situation stabilizes slightly, a consortium of major bankers having met, having agreed to support market, buying stocks to restore confidence, the action being what stopped 1907 panic, being what worked before, being what they hope will work again. The psychology being that showing confidence creates confidence, that buying stems selling, that leadership can calm panic. The theory being reasonable even if circumstances are different, even if problem is bigger than they realize, even if their resources are insufficient. The afternoon brings temporary relief, prices recovering somewhat, the banker's intervention being visible, being reported, creating hope that worst is over, that Thursday was scare but not catastrophe. that Friday will bring recovery, that weekend will allow reflection, that Monday will see return to normal. The hope being what humans cling to, what allows them to continue, what prevents complete despair. The denial being psychological necessity, being defense mechanism, being what makes bearable the unbearable, at least temporarily. You find yourself now in evening gathering Friday, October 25th, the day after Black Thursday, the mood being cautiously optimistic. People wanting to believe crisis is past, that intervention worked, that market will recover, the dinner conversation being forced cheer, determined optimism, refusal to contemplate alternatives, the social pressure being to maintain composure, to show confidence, to not panic. The appearance of calm being important, even when fear gnaws internally, even when sleep will be difficult, even when worry dominates private thoughts. The newspapers. Friday evening are reassuring, mostly, the headlines saying worst over, predicting recovery, quoting experts who insist fundamentals are sound, who claim Thursday was healthy correction, who argue that market needed adjustment but remains strong, the editorial position being to calm fears, to prevent bank runs, to maintain confidence in system. The media being part of mechanism of control, of social order, of preventing panic from spreading from financial markets to broader economy, the attempt being understandable even if ultimately futile. The weekend passes in uneasy quiet, banks being closed, exchange being closed, families discussing what happened, what it means, whether they should sell Monday, whether they should hold, whether their savings are safe, whether America is entering recession or depression, the speculation being rampant, the information being scarce, the uncertainty being what weighs heaviest, what prevents rest, what makes Sunday evening approach with dread rather than normal reluctance for work week to begin. Monday, October 28th brings renewed selling, worse than Thursday, the weekend having allowed panic to grow rather than subside, having given time for realization to sink in, for denial to crack, for fear to overwhelm hope, the opening bell bringing flood of sell orders, brokers being overwhelmed immediately, prices dropping precipitously, the support from previous week being absent, the bankers having realized they cannot stop tide, having withdrawn from market, having decided to protect themselves rather than system, the every man for himself phase beginning, the moment when social cohesion breaks, when it becomes clear that no authority can prevent collapse, that each person faces ruin alone, individually, without help. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, is even worse, being day that becomes synonym for financial collapse, for market crash, for end of era, the selling being relentless, the volume being record-breaking, 16 million shares, trading hands. The number being incomprehensible, being triple normal volume, being indication of complete loss of confidence, of total panic, of desperate desire to sell at any price, to get out, to cut losses, to salvage anything from wreckage, the prices being irrelevant, only exit mattering, only escape being goal. The ticker tape falls 4 hours behind, the machines unable to process volume, printing continuously but falling further behind with each passing hour, the operators watching prices from hours ago being displayed while current prices are much lower. The disconnect being what makes panic worse, what prevents rational decision-making, what creates information vacuum filled by rumour, by fear, by worst-case assumptions that turn out to be accurate. The technology failing just when needed most, the infrastructure being inadequate for crisis, the systems designed for normal times being overwhelmed by exceptional circumstances. Remember those confident investors from 1928 watching their portfolios grow, planning retirements, discussing further purchases. Now they stand stunned, watching fortunes disappear, receiving margin calls they cannot meet, seeing life savings vanish, facing reality that paper wealth was ephemeral, that gains were temporary, that bubble has burst, leaving behind not profits but debts, obligations that must be paid with money they don't have, assets they can't sell, futures that no longer exist. The reversal being complete, being devastating, being what turns optimism into despair, confidence into fear, prosperity into poverty, into despair. The scene outside the Exchange Tuesday afternoon is grim. Crowds standing silent mostly, stunned, disbelieving, watching the physical manifestation of their losses, seeing their dreams evaporate, understanding that life has changed, that easy money is gone, that struggle lies ahead, the psychological impact being immeasurable, being what statistics cannot capture, being human cost of financial collapse, being broken spirits, shattered confidence, uncertain futures, the intangible losses being greater than numerical losses, being harder to recover from, being what creates depression both economic and psychological, both collective and personal. The suicides begin being reported, successful businessmen choosing death over facing ruin, the myth of stockbrokers jumping from windows being exaggerated but based on reality, some choosing exit rather than struggle, the tragedy being what shows depth of despair, what reveals how identity was tied to wealth, how self-worth was measured by portfolio value, how losing money meant losing self, the psychology being what modern era would understand better, would have support for, would treat rather than stigmatise, but 1929 having no such framework, no such compassion, only judgment, only shame, only pressure to bear burden silently, alone. You stand now in early November 1929, the immediate panic having passed, the market having stabilised at much lower level, the new reality being accepted if not understood, the magnitude of decline being 40% in few weeks, billions of dollars of paper wealth having vanished, but the broader economy still seeming intact, unemployment still low, factories still operating, most people still having jobs. The hope being that financial crisis will be contained, will not spread to real economy, will be painful for investors but not catastrophic for nation. The wishful thinking being understandable, being what everyone wants to believe, being wrong in ways that will become clear over coming months and years. The brokerage offices are quieter now, many customers having lost everything, having stopped coming, the remaining clients being shell-shocked, the brokers being subdued, the optimism being gone, replaced by uncertainty, by caution, by recognition that easy money era is over, that recovery will be slow if it comes at all, that trust has been broken, that confidence will not return quickly, the psychological damage being what takes longest to repair, being what prevents quick recovery, being what makes depressions last years rather than months, being human element that economics struggles to model, to predict, to account for in theories developed from mathematics rather than psychology. The daily routine has changed. Mornings no longer bringing rush to check stock prices, lunches no longer involving excited discussions of market gains, evenings no longer celebrating paper profits, the absence being notable, being void left by mania's end, being what remains when collective delusion lifts, when reality returns, when sober assessment replaces intoxicated optimism, the hangover from boom being painful, being long-lasting, being period of regret and recrimination, of what-ifs and if-onlys, of blame and finger-pointing, of searching for scapegoats, for explanations, for understanding of how prosperity turned to panic so quickly, so completely, so devastatingly. The story continues from here, from this moment of shock and dawning realization, through years of hardship ahead, through bank failures and unemployment, through Dust Bowl and breadlines, through New Deal experiments and slow recovery. The journey being long, being difficult, being what shaped generation, what created safety nets, what reformed capitalism, what taught lessons that would be forgotten eventually, that would be relearned painfully in future crises, the cycle being eternal, being human, being what happens when greed overcomes fear, when confidence becomes arrogance, when prosperity is mistaken for permanent condition rather than temporary phase in endless cycle of boom and bust, expansion and contraction, confidence and panic, the pattern being what history teaches, what each generation experiences anew, what continues despite knowledge, despite warnings, despite precedents, because human nature remains constant even as technology changes, as institutions evolve, as systems are reformed, the underlying psychology being eternal, being what drives markets, what creates bubbles, what ensures cycles continue, the patient work of economic history proceeding through decades, through centuries, through the accumulated experience of prosperity and collapse, of boom and bust, of the eternal human drama of wealth and poverty, confidence and fear, hope and despair. The crash marks the end of one era and beginning of another, the transition being what Americans will live through over coming decade, the transformation being what shapes nation, reforms economy, creates safety nets, teaches lessons that echo through generations, the story advancing now toward those difficult years, toward bank failures and unemployment, toward recovery and reform, the patient journey through Great Depression beginning its slow measured progression through history, through memory, through the lessons that prosperity forgot and adversity teaches, the narrative proceeding forward through time. Months pass, the calendar turning from 1929 into 1930, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, the seasons changing as they always do, indifferent to human troubles, nature continuing its cycles while civilization struggles with consequences of financial collapse, the disconnect being what makes hardship seem arbitrary, unfair, being reminder that economic systems are human constructions, fragile, dependent on confidence and trust, collapsing when those foundations crack, leaving people exposed to forces they cannot control, cannot understand, can only endure. You find yourself now standing outside a neighbourhood bank on quiet residential street, the date being autumn 1930, the morning being cool, the sky being overcast, the atmosphere being tense, anxious, a crowd having formed before doors open, people clutching passbooks, withdrawal slips, the determination on faces being obvious, being what bank run looks like, being collective panic, being self-fulfilling prophecy, being rational response for individual that creates catastrophe for collective, the tragedy of commons playing out in financial sector. The bank is modest building, brick facade, brass fixtures, marble lobby visible through glass doors, the architecture being solid, permanent seeming, designed to inspire confidence, to suggest stability, to reassure depositors that their money is safe, the irony being that safety depends on belief, on trust, on majority of depositors not withdrawing simultaneously. The fractional reserve system working only when people trust it, failing immediately when they don't, the psychology being what matters more than mathematics, confidence being foundation on which entire structure rests. The crowd grows larger as opening time approaches, more people arriving, joining queue, the rumours having spread through neighbourhood, telephone calls, conversations over fences, whispers in grocery stores, the contagion being social as much as financial, fear spreading from person to person, family to family, the collective anxiety feeding on itself, creating momentum, building pressure, ensuring that rumour becomes reality, that fear becomes fact, that prophecy fulfills itself through the very attempt to avoid it. Inside, you watch through windows as bank employees arrive, unlocking doors, preparing for day, their faces being strained, worried, knowing what approaches, having seen crowds forming, understanding what crowd means, that bank will be tested, that vault contains insufficient cash to satisfy everyone, that choices will be made about who gets money, who doesn't, who arrives early enough, who waits too long. The arbitrary cruelty of first come, first served being what bank run produces. Cruelty of first. The doors open at 9 a.m, crowds surging forward, the rush being controlled barely, bank employees trying to maintain order, to process withdrawals methodically, the tellers counting cash carefully, slowly, each transaction taking minutes, the line moving gradually, tensions rising as people wait, watch, calculate whether money will last, whether they'll reach counter before vault empties, the mathematics being simple, cruel, inevitable for those at end of line. The smell inside is familiar bank smell, paper and ink, leather-bound ledgers, brass polish, but overlaid with sweat of fear, tension of crowd, the atmosphere being what panic smells like, being human anxiety made physical, being palpable dread, being collective fear that no amount of marble and brass can hide, no architectural confidence can overcome, no professional demeanour can calm, the facade being stripped away, revealing truth that bank is just building, that deposits are just promises, that safety is illusion maintained by collective belief. The sound is distinctive, being voices asking for withdrawals, tellers calling for more cash from vault, the counting of bills, the scratch of pens on withdrawal slips, the shuffle of feet as line moves forward, the whispered conversations of worried depositors, the crying of child somewhere in crowd, the entire symphony of financial panic, of social breakdown, of system failure playing out in real time in this small neighbourhood bank that represents thousands of similar scenes across nation. You watch as depositors reach counter, present passbooks, request entire balance, some asking politely, some demanding, some pleading, the variation being personality, being how stress manifests differently in different people, some becoming aggressive, some becoming desperate, some maintaining dignity, even in crisis, the human diversity being what remains constant even as circumstances change, even as prosperity becomes poverty, even as confidence becomes fear. The bank employees maintain professional demeanour, counting carefully, providing receipts, closing accounts, the routine being familiar, even if volume is unprecedented, even if circumstances are extraordinary. The training being what allows them to function under stress, to process transactions methodically, to serve customers even while knowing that they are witnessing bank's death, that their jobs will end when vault empties, that they too face unemployment, uncertainty, hardship ahead. By noon the crowd has not diminished, more people arriving as morning progresses, as word spreads, as those who got money tell others, recommend they withdraw too, the cascade being inevitable, being what makes single bank failure spread to others, what makes local panic become regional crisis, what makes recession become depression, the connectivity being weakness in system, the interdependence being vulnerability, the trust being fragile thing that breaks easily, repairs slowly. The vault cash depletes gradually, the bank manager making calls to correspondent banks, to Federal Reserve, seeking emergency funds, the help being insufficient, being too slow, being inadequate to stem panic, the system having no mechanism to provide enough cash quickly enough to satisfy simultaneous demands of multiple banks, multiple cities, multiple regions, all experiencing runs simultaneously, the problem being systemic, being beyond capacity of existing institutions to resolve, requiring intervention that won't come, reforms that aren't yet imagined, insurance that doesn't yet exist. Early afternoon brings the moment everyone feared, the teller apologising to customer, explaining that vault is empty, that no more withdrawals can be processed, that bank must close, the words being what triggers final panic, desperate demands, angry recriminations, the crowd understanding that those still in line have lost everything, that their life savings are gone, trapped in failed bank, unlikely to ever be recovered. The magnitude of loss being incomprehensible, being what breaks people, being difference between security and destitution, between comfortable retirement and homeless poverty. The bank doors close, the shades being drawn, the lights going off, the building that opened that morning as functioning institution becoming tomb, monument to failed trust, symbol of broken promises, the physical structure remaining, but essence being gone, the bank being legally dead, deposits being legally lost, the legal protections being non-existent, no FDIC insurance existing yet, no federal guarantee, no safety net, depositors having no recourse except hope that eventual liquidation returns some percentage. Probably small, probably years later, probably too late to prevent immediate hardship. You stand now in early 1931, different city, different bank, same scene repeating, the pattern being established, being what Americans witness repeatedly through these years, 9,000 banks failing between 1930 and 1933. The number being staggering, being third of all banks in country, being what destroys trust in banking system entirely, being what makes people hoard cash, stuff mattresses, bury money in yards, the rational response to repeated betrayals, the logical conclusion when institutions fail, when systems collapse, when promises prove empty. The bank failures create spiral, each closure reducing money supply, reducing lending, reducing business activity, reducing employment, reducing income, reducing deposits, causing more failures, the cycle being vicious, being self-reinforcing, being what makes recovery impossible without intervention, without breaking cycle, without restoring confidence through mechanism stronger than private sector can provide. The need for federal action becoming obvious, even if not yet accepted, even if political philosophy resists, even if ideology prevents action that economics demands. The factories close in response, businesses failing without credit, without customers, without ability to finance operations, the unemployment rising steadily, from 3% in 1929 to 15% in 1931. Toward 25% in 1933, the numbers being cold statistics that represent human tragedies, families without income, children without food, homes being foreclosed, dreams being shattered, the personal cost being incalculable, being beyond what numbers capture, being millions of individual stories of struggle and survival, hardship and adaptation. You find yourself now on Great Plains Farm, the season being spring 1931, standing in field that should be green with young wheat, instead seeing brown earth, dry soil, no crops growing, the drought being in its second year, the topsoil having lost moisture, vegetation dying, the land beginning transformation that will make it dust bowl, that will force migration, that will create environmental catastrophe overlaying economic catastrophe. The combination being what makes rural depression especially severe, especially tragic. The farmer stands beside you, his face weathered, concerned, watching sky for clouds that don't come, for rain that doesn't fall, the worry being justified, being prescient, being recognition that nature is turning against him, that years of ploughing have removed native grasses, have exposed topsoil to wind, have created conditions for disaster, that farming practices sustainable in wet years become catastrophic in drought. The lesson being learned too late, being paid for in abandoned farms, in dust storms, in exodus. The morning inspection of fields is ritual, walking rows, checking for moisture, for any sign of growth, finding none, the repetition being what maintains hope, what prevents despair, what allows farmer to continue. Despite evidence that crop will fail, that harvest won't come, that mortgage payment cannot be made, that bank will foreclose, that land worked for generations will be lost, the slow recognition being what these months bring, the gradual acceptance of defeat, of loss, of need to abandon home, to migrate west, to become refugees in own country. The smell is distinctive, being dry earth, dust in air, absence of normal spring smells of growing things, of wet soil, of green plants, the absence being what signals disaster, being sensory evidence that something fundamental has changed, that patterns have broken, that nature itself has turned hostile. The psychology being what this does, making people question everything, doubt themselves, feel abandoned by God, by nature, by fate, the crisis of faith being as real as crisis of economics. The wind begins rising, the sound being what Great Plains residents know too well, being what brings dust, being what strips away topsoil, being what turns day to night, being what makes breathing difficult, seeing impossible, living intolerable, the dust storms being phenomenon that will define era, that will force change, that will require federal intervention, that will teach lessons about land management, about sustainability, about limits of human ability to control nature, to bend environment to will without consequence. The dust cloud approaches from west, being visible miles away, dark rolling mass blocking horizon, advancing steadily, unstoppably, the sight being terrifying, being biblical in scale, being what makes people think of plagues, of apocalypse, of divine judgment, the religious interpretation being natural response to natural disaster of such magnitude, the need to understand, to explain, to find meaning in chaos being human tendency, being what helps people cope, what allows them to continue. The family retreats inside, closing windows, stuffing rags in cracks, covering faces with wet cloths, huddling together as darkness descends at midday, the sound outside being roar of wind, the house shaking, dust finding its way inside. Despite precautions coating everything, being in eyes, in throat, in lungs, the experience being what defines Dust Bowl, being what photographs cannot fully capture, being suffering that statistics cannot measure, being human cost of environmental catastrophe. The storm passes after hours, leaving behind inches of dust, burying fences, covering roads, filling ditches, the landscape transformed, unrecognisable, the clean-up being impossible, more storms coming, depositing more dust, the accumulation being what finally breaks farmers, what forces decision to leave, to abandon land, to join migration west toward California, toward promise of work, of opportunity, of escape from this brown hell. Remember the 1920s agricultural prosperity, the mechanization, the increased production, the confident expansion. Now those farmers who borrowed to buy tractors, to expand acreage, face foreclosure, bankruptcy, the irony being that success created vulnerability, that investments made in good times become burdens in bad, that progress contains seeds of disaster when circumstances change, when drought comes, when markets collapse, when debts come due and cannot be paid. You find yourself now on Highway 66, the famous road west, watching families passing in overloaded trucks, mattresses tied to roofs, children sitting among belongings, the exodus being what John Steinbeck will document, what Dorothea Lange will photograph, what Woody Guthrie will sing about, the migration being American tragedy, being displacement, being refugees in own country, being loss of homes, roots, community, identity, everything except family and determination to survive. The migrants are called Okies, regardless of actual origin, the term being derogatory, being what Californians call them, resent them, fear them, the prejudice being real, being violent sometimes, the camps where they live being squalid, the work they find being picking crops for starvation wages, the promise of California being broken promise, the reality being exploitation, suffering, continued hardship, the American dream becoming American nightmare for these displaced farmers. The American Time moves forward, you now standing in city breadline, winter 1932, the cold being bitter, the line being long, hundreds of men waiting patiently, desperately, for bowl of soup, piece of bread, the charity being insufficient, overwhelmed, the demand exceeding supply, the volunteers trying their best, ladling thin soup, passing out stale bread, the dignity being what they try to preserve, what recipients try to maintain, the shame being what society imposes, what depression adds to hunger, what makes poverty psychological torture as much as physical hardship. The men in line are quiet mostly, not talking much, conserving energy, staying warm through movement, shuffling forward slowly, the hours passing, the cold seeping through worn coats, through shoes with cardboard filling holes, through thin layers that are inadequate for winter, the suffering being silent, being dignified, being what photographs capture, what images preserve, what becomes iconic representation of depression, the breadline being symbol, being reality for millions, being daily routine of survival. The smell is wood smoke from homeless camps nearby, the Hoovervilles where unemployed men live in cardboard shacks, the name being bitter joke about President Hoover, blaming him for depression, for inadequate response, for believing in volunteerism when systematic action needed. The naming being how powerless express anger, how frustrated assign blame, how suffering seeks scapegoat, the psychology being understandable even if unfair. Hoover being victim of timing as much as policy, inheriting bubble, watching it burst, trying traditional responses that prove inadequate for unprecedented crisis. The Hoovervilles are cities within cities, makeshift communities of desperate people, built from scrap materials, cardboard, tar paper, old lumber. The structures being temporary but becoming permanent, the residents being skilled workers, office workers, family men who never imagined living this way, the middle class being proletarianized, the formerly respectable becoming homeless, the American success story becoming American tragedy, the reversal being complete, being devastating, being what breaks spirits, what destroys confidence, what creates generations scarred by insecurity. You walk through Hooverville, the narrow paths between shacks being muddy, the smell being unwashed bodies, smoke, poverty, the sight being families huddled around fires, children playing despite circumstances, women trying to maintain cleanliness, normalcy, dignity in impossible conditions, the resilience being remarkable, being human capacity to adapt, to endure, to maintain humanity even in dehumanizing circumstances, the strength being what allows survival, what prevents complete collapse, what keeps hope alive despite evidence suggesting hopelessness. The daily routine in Hooverville starts early, men leaving at dawn for shape-ups, standing at corners where employers come looking for day labourers, the work being sporadic, low-paying, competitive, hundreds applying for few positions, the selection being arbitrary, demoralising, the rejection being daily experience for most, the lucky few getting work, the majority returning to camp, to waiting, to hoping tomorrow brings opportunity, the cycle being grinding, exhausting, soul-destroying, the unemployment being not just economic problem, but psychological crisis. The children suffer differently, not understanding why circumstances changed, why daddy doesn't work, why they're hungry, why they live in cardboard shack, the innocence being what breaks hearts, what motivates parents to continue, what provides reason to endure, to seek work, to maintain hope, the family being what holds people together, what prevents complete despair, what gives meaning to struggle, what makes survival worthwhile even when prospects seem hopeless. The apple sellers appear on street corners, former businessmen, professionals, selling apples for nickel, the image becoming symbol of depression, the reality being desperate attempt to maintain dignity, to work rather than beg, to participate in commerce even if commerce is selling fruit on sidewalk, the psychology being important, being difference between charity and transaction, between helpless and helping self, between victim and survivor. The distinction being what maintains self-respect, what allows pride despite poverty. Though historians later debate actual starvation rates during Depression, some arguing widespread hunger but limited starvation due to rural subsistence farming and charity networks, others documenting malnutrition, related deaths, especially among children and elderly. The debate being academic to those who lived through severe hunger, who skipped meals so children could eat, who felt constant gnawing emptiness, who weakened from insufficient nutrition. The statistics being what scholars argue about, the suffering being what people remember. The churches and charities do what they can, running soup kitchens, providing shelter, distributing clothes, the volunteers being tireless, dedicated, compassionate, but resources being inadequate, demand being overwhelming, the private charity being insufficient for catastrophe of this scale, the need for government intervention being obvious to everyone except those in government, the ideological resistance to federal relief being what delays help, what prolongs suffering, what eventually must yield to reality. You stand now watching newsreel in cheap theatre, winter 1932, the images showing Herbert Hoover, his face being dour, his demeanour being stiff, his words being reassuring but unconvincing, promising that prosperity is just around the corner, insisting that voluntary cooperation will solve problems, that federal relief would harm rather than help. The philosophy being principled but inadequate, being 19th century thinking applied to 20th century problem, being what costs him re-election, what dooms Republicans for generation. The bonus army marches on Washington that summer, veterans of World War I demanding early payment of bonuses promised for 1945, the need being immediate, the situation being desperate, thousands camping in Capitol, the government responding eventually with force, army troops led by Douglas MacArthur driving veterans from camps, burning shacks, the violence being what shocks nation, what symbolises Hoover's failure, what demonstrates disconnect between government and governed, between comfortable and suffering. The 1932 campaign brings Franklin Roosevelt, his confidence contrasting with Hoover's grimness, his promise of New Deal being vague but hopeful, his willingness to experiment being what voters want, the change being what matters more than specifics, the desperation being what drives landslide, the need for different approach being obvious, the faith in FDR being partly rational, partly desperate hope that someone, anyone, can fix problems that seem unsolvable. The election night brings Democratic victory so complete as to be almost embarrassing, Hoover carrying 6 states, FDR winning everywhere else, the mandate being clear, the rejection of old approach being definitive, the demand for action being unmistakable, the American people voting for change without knowing exactly what change will bring, trusting that action is better than inaction, that trying is better than waiting, that government must do something even if uncertain what. The months between election and inauguration are worst yet, the lame duck period being when banking system finally collapses completely, when states declare bank holidays to prevent runs, when financial system essentially ceases functioning, the crisis being what greets Roosevelt, being situation he inherits, being challenge that will define his presidency, test his leadership, determine whether democracy can respond to economic catastrophe, or whether authoritarian alternatives will seem attractive. You find yourself now in early March 1933, Inauguration Day approaching, the nation waiting anxiously. Banks closed nationwide, money frozen, commerce paralysed, the crisis being as severe as can be without complete collapse. The question being whether democratic government can respond effectively, whether capitalism, can reform itself, whether system can adapt or whether radical alternatives will prevail, the historical moment being pivotal, being test of American institutions, being challenge that will determine future. The breadlines continue, the Hoovervilles persist, the dust storms blow, the foreclosures proceed, the unemployment remains at 25%, the suffering being at peak, being what makes population receptive to bold action, willing to accept dramatic changes, open to experimentation, the crisis being what creates opportunity for reform, what makes possible transformations that would be unthinkable in normal times, what allows government expansion that peacetime prosperity would never permit. The farmers continue their struggle, the ones who haven't migrated yet, trying to maintain operations without credit, without markets, without hope really, the persistence being remarkable, being testimony to attachment to land, to roots, to identity tied to place, to reluctance to abandon what generations built. The eventual surrender being forced, being reluctant, being tragic, being what creates wave of migration, what populates California labor camps, what provides cheap workers for corporate farms, what enriches some while impoverishing many. The middle class continues shrinking, families losing homes, professionals becoming labourers, office workers becoming homeless, the social mobility being downward, the American promise being broken, the meritocracy being revealed as fraud when hard work cannot prevent poverty, when education cannot guarantee employment, when playing by rules leads to ruin, the disillusionment being complete, being what threatens social order, being what requires response, being what New Deal will address. The children grow up malnourished, undereducated, traumatized, the generation being marked by experience, being shaped by hardship, being what will emerge as adults scarred by insecurity, driven by desire for security, willing to sacrifice freedom for stability, the psychological impact being lasting, being what creates conservative fiscal attitudes, what makes depression generation cautious, careful, averse to debt, to risk, to speculation, the lessons being learned through suffering, being remembered through lifetime. The elderly face particular hardship, retirement savings lost in bank failures, pensions cut or eliminated, families unable to support them, almshouses being overwhelmed, the indignity being what Social Security will address, what creates political support for old age insurance, what makes welfare state acceptable to Americans who previously opposed government assistance, the crisis being what makes reform possible, what breaks resistance to change, what allows ideas that seemed socialist to become mainstream. The women adapt to depression differently, many entering workforce from necessity, taking jobs men won't accept, working for lower wages, maintaining families when husbands cannot, the strength being what holds society together, what prevents complete breakdown, what keeps children fed, homes maintained, hope alive, the contribution being under-recognised, undervalued but essential, being what allows survival, what enables endurance. The African Americans suffer disproportionately, being last hired, first fired, being excluded from many relief programs, facing discrimination that compounds economic hardship, the racism being systemic, being institutional, being what New Deal sometimes reinforces rather than challenges. The progress being limited, incomplete, inadequate, but movement nonetheless, seeds being planted for civil rights movement decades later. The injustice being documented, recognised, creating foundation for future change. The ethnic communities provide support networks, Italian neighbourhoods, Polish communities, Jewish enclaves, helping their own, sharing resources, maintaining culture, being buffer against complete destitution. The solidarity being what preserves identity, what provides strength, what demonstrates that humans are social animals, that community matters, that isolation is vulnerability, that connection is survival mechanism. The lesson being what modern individualism forgets, what depression teaches, what subsequent prosperity allows people to forget. The crime increases as legitimate opportunities disappear, bank robberies becoming common, Bonnie and Clyde becoming folk heroes, Pretty Boy Floyd being romanticised, the criminals being seen as rebelling against system that failed people, the Robin Hood mythology being applied despite reality, the psychology revealing resentment against banks, against wealthy, against establishment that presided over collapse, the anger being channeled sometimes into crime, sometimes into politics, the potential for violence being real, being what motivates reform, being stick that accompanies carrot of New Deal. The communist and socialist movements gain support, organising unions, leading strikes, proposing alternatives to capitalism, the ideological challenge being real, being what frightens establishment, being what makes moderate reforms seem preferable to radical revolution, the political spectrum shifting left, the acceptable discourse changing, the possible becoming probable, the unthinkable becoming thinkable. The crisis being what moves Overton window, what makes New Deal possible politically. The family structures adapt, multiple generations living together, adults moving back with parents, grandparents moving in with children, the nuclear family ideal being impossible luxury, the extended family being necessity, being survival strategy, being what provides shelter, shares resources, pools incomes, the traditional forms being what depression restores, what prosperity had begun dissolving, what hardship makes essential again. The entertainment industry thrives paradoxically, movies being cheap escape, radio being free once purchased, the need for distraction being strong, for hope being powerful, for fantasy being intense, Hollywood producing musicals, comedies, escapist fare, the contradiction being that unemployed still finding nickels for movies, that despair needing relief, that humans requiring beauty, laughter, hope even in darkest times, especially in darkest times. The migration west continues through these years, Route 66 becoming Trail of Tears, Exodus route, Highway of Hope and Despair, the journey being arduous, vehicles breaking down, families stranded, children dying sometimes, the harshness being real, being what survivors remember, being trauma that marks generation, being story that becomes legend, becomes mythology, becomes American epic of suffering and survival. The California reception is hostile, border patrols trying to turn back migrants, vigilantes attacking camps, newspapers publishing editorials against Okies, the nativism being ugly, being violent, being what desperate people face when seeking refuge, the American hospitality being conditional, being selective, being absent when needed most, the hypocrisy being what crisis reveals, what prosperity hides. The corporate farms employ migrants at starvation wages, the working conditions being brutal, the housing being squalid, the exploitation being systematic, being legal, being what capitalism does when labour is desperate, when regulations are absent, when power imbalance is complete, the injustice being what eventually drives unionisation, drives reform, drives change, but not yet, not during worst years, not when workers have no leverage, no alternatives, no choice but to accept whatever is offered. The Dust Bowl continues through mid-1930s, the storms being apocalyptic, Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935 being worst, darkness at noon, visibility zero, the disaster being what finally forces federal action, Soil Conservation Service being created, farmers being taught new techniques, shelter belt trees being planted, the response being what eventually fixes problem, what restores land, what prevents recurrence, the intervention being successful, being model for environmental policy, being proof that government action can solve problems that market cannot, that individual actions cannot address. The years blend together in memory, 1931, 1932, 1933, each being hard, each bringing new challenges, each testing endurance, the cumulative effect being what breaks people, what forces change, what creates support for New Deal, the duration being what distinguishes this depression from previous panics, the length being what makes it great, what makes it defining event of generation, what creates political realignment, what changes America fundamentally. You stand now in winter of 1933, just before Roosevelt's inauguration, the nation being at nadir. Unemployment at peak, banks closed, commerce paralysed, suffering at maximum, hope at minimum, but also moment being when change becomes possible, when reform becomes necessary, when boldness becomes acceptable, when experimentation becomes essential, the crisis being at point where either dramatic action or dramatic failure will occur, where America either solves problems or faces consequences too terrible to contemplate, where democracy either proves capable of response or proves inadequate to challenge. The scene is set for transformation, for New Deal, for government activism that will define American liberalism for generation, for programs that will create safety net, for reforms that will regulate capitalism, for intervention that will restore confidence, for experimentation that will sometimes fail but collectively succeed in stabilizing system, in preventing collapse, in maintaining democracy when authoritarianism seems attractive, when fascism and communism are rising abroad, when American system is being tested, when question is whether democratic capitalism can reform itself or whether radical alternatives are necessary. Remember those confident stockbrokers from 1928 celebrating gains, buying on margin, believing in endless prosperity. Some jumped from windows, some lost everything, most survived diminished, chastened, learning lessons about hubris, about leverage, about bubbles, about the eternal cycle of boom and bust, greed and fear, confidence and panic, the pattern being what repeats through history, what each generation experiences, what no amount of regulation can prevent entirely, what human nature ensures continues. The wisdom being to moderate extremes, to soften cycles, to provide safety nets, to regulate excess, to learn from past even if cannot prevent future mistakes. The farmers who left Dust Bowl, who migrated west, who suffered in California camps, eventually finding work, eventually rebuilding, eventually recovering, but never forgetting, never quite trusting prosperity again, always saving, always cautious, always remembering brown days, dust storms, hunger, loss, the experience being scar tissue, being what shapes attitudes, being what creates conservative fiscal behaviour, being what makes depression generation different from children, grandchildren who only know prosperity, who cannot imagine hardship, who repeat mistakes because they never experienced consequences. The breadline queues, the Hooverville shacks, the bank run crowds, all being images that define era, that represent suffering, that document hardship, that preserve memory of difficult period, that teach lessons, or should teach lessons, that remind future generations that prosperity is temporary, that systems can fail, that confidence can collapse, that safety nets matter, that regulation serves purpose, that government has role, that capitalism needs restraint, that excess leads to crisis, that boom becomes bust, that cycle continues, the pattern being eternal, being human, being what we must recognise even if cannot entirely prevent. The human cost of Great Depression is incalculable, being measured not just in unemployment statistics, in bank failures, in foreclosures, but in broken families, in lost opportunities, in stunted childhoods, in truncated educations, in psychological trauma, in political radicalisation, in social disruption, in all the intangible ways that poverty and insecurity damage people, damage society, damage futures, the suffering being real even if difficult to quantify, being what makes depression great, not in sense of good, but in sense of magnitude, of significance, of impact that reverberates through generations, through decades, through American history, through collective memory. The story continues from here, from this moment of maximum crisis, toward New Deal response, toward recovery that will be slow, halting, incomplete, toward reforms that will reshape American capitalism, toward safety nets that will prevent future suffering at this scale, toward regulations that will moderate future booms, toward interventions that will soften future busts. The narrative advancing toward hope, toward action, toward change. The patient progression through history, proceeding from despair toward recovery, from crisis toward reform, from breakdown toward reconstruction, the journey being what Part 3 explores, being what comes next, being transformation that depression makes possible, that crisis enables, that suffering demands, that democracy delivers. Imperfectly but effectively, the American system proving capable of reform, of adaptation, of learning from failure, of emerging from crisis stronger, wiser, more just, more secure. The progress being real even if incomplete, the improvement being genuine even if insufficient, the change being what distinguishes great democracies from failed states, what separates systems that adapt from systems that collapse, what proves that capitalism can be reformed, that markets can be regulated, that government can help, that collective action matters, that society can protect its members, that prosperity can be shared more widely, that security can be provided more broadly, that dignity can be maintained more universally, the lessons being learned, being applied, being what comes next in story, the narrative proceeding forward through time, through experience, through the patient accumulation of wisdom, through the painful process of learning from mistakes, through the gradual improvement of systems, through the slow advance toward more just, more secure, more prosperous society, the journey continuing, the story advancing, the history proceeding forward through years, through decades, through the long arc of American development, through the eternal human project of building civilization, of managing economy, of ensuring security, of providing opportunity, of maintaining hope, of creating future worth living, the work being incomplete, being ongoing, being what each generation inherits, improves, passes forward, the responsibility being eternal, the challenge being constant, the progress being possible when wisdom prevails, when compassion guides, when justice matters, when security is valued, when opportunity is provided, when dignity is protected, when society functions, when democracy works, when capitalism is reformed, when government serves, when people endure, when hope persists, when future beckons, when story continues its patient measured advance through time. The winter of 1933 deepens, March approaching, Inauguration Day nearing, the nation holding its breath, waiting for change, for action, for anything that might break paralysis, that might restore confidence, that might offer hope, the desperation being what creates opportunity, being what allows boldness, being what makes possible the transformation that is coming, the New Deal that will reshape America, the reforms that will create modern welfare state, the interventions that will stabilize capitalism, the programs that will provide security, the story advancing toward that moment, toward that change, toward recovery that begins with Roosevelt's famous words about fear, about courage, about action, the narrative proceeding forward through history, through time, through the patient evolution of American democracy, through crisis toward resolution, through darkness toward dawn, the journey continuing into Part 3, into recovery, into reform, into future that is being built from ruins of past, the Great Depression advancing toward its next chapter, toward hope emerging from despair, toward action replacing paralysis, toward change that will define generation, that will shape nation, that will teach lessons, that will create systems, that will build structures, that will provide foundations for prosperity yet to come. The patient work proceeding forward through time. You find yourself now listening to radio, March 4th, 1933, Inauguration Day, the voice coming through speaker, being confident, reassuring, Franklin Roosevelt beginning his presidency with words that will echo through history. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The phrase being what nation needs to hear, being psychology more than economics, being recognition that confidence is foundation, that belief matters, that collective mindset determines outcomes as much as policies do. The speech being masterpiece of leadership, of communication, of understanding that depression is crisis of spirit as much as crisis of economy. The fireside chats begin immediately, Roosevelt speaking directly to people through radio, explaining policies in conversational tone, demystifying government, building trust, the innovation being what makes him effective, being how he maintains support through experimentation, through failures, through long recovery, the communication being gift, being tool, being what allows bold action, what sustains confidence when results are slow, what keeps hope alive through difficult years ahead. The bank holiday is declared immediately, all banks closing for week, the pause being what stops panic, what allows assessment, what enables Emergency Banking Act to pass, the speed being unprecedented, Congress acting in hours, Roosevelt signing same day. The crisis being what enables action, what breaks gridlock, what makes possible what would be impossible in normal times. The lesson being that sometimes destruction precedes construction, that sometimes systems must fail before they can be reformed. The banks reopen gradually, only sound institutions being allowed to open, depositors returning cautiously, testing whether government guarantee means anything, whether confidence is justified, the gradual success being what stabilizes system, what prevents further runs, what allows credit to flow again. The intervention being what orthodox economics said was impossible, being what Hoover resisted, being what Roosevelt embraces, the difference being philosophical, being what separates conservative from liberal, being what defines New Deal approach. You stand now in spring 1933 watching young men signing up for Civilian Conservation Corps, the programme being what puts unemployed to work, what sends them to forests, to national parks, to rural areas, what gives them jobs planting trees, building trails, fighting fires, the work being useful, being dignified, being what restores self-respect, being better than charity, being investment in future, being conservation that benefits nation while helping individuals, the elegance being what makes CCC successful, popular, remembered fondly by those who participated. The CCC camps are organised like military units, discipline being part of programme, structure being what young men need, routine being what provides stability, the morning reveille, the work assignments, the evening return to camp, the meals being regular, nutrition being adequate, the physical labour being exhausting but satisfying, the exhaustion being healthy kind, being what earns rest, what allows sleep, what builds strength, the contrast with urban unemployment being complete, being what makes programme transformative for participants. The smell of camp is wood smoke, pine trees, sweat from labour, the meals being simple but filling, the bunks being hard but welcome after days' work. The companionship being what many remember best, the friendships forged through shared experience, shared hardship, shared purpose, the community being what depression destroyed in cities, what CCC restores in camps, what humans need, what capitalism sometimes fails to provide, what government can facilitate when it tries. The work itself varies, some days planting trees, Some days building roads, some days clearing brush, some days fighting fires, the variety being what prevents boredom, the visible results being what provides satisfaction, the forest growing, the trail completed, the park improved, the legacy being what outlasts depression, what people visit today, what represents one success of New Deal, what demonstrates that government spending can create value, can invest wisely, can benefit present and future simultaneously. Though economists later debate whether New Deal ended depression or merely helped, some arguing that only World War II spending fully restored employment, others crediting New Deal programs with preventing complete collapse and enabling gradual recovery. The debate being academic to those whose lives improved, who got jobs, who regained dignity, who survived because of programs, who experienced government as helper rather than burden. The lived experience being what matters more than statistical analysis, being what creates political loyalty, being what realigns American politics for generation. The Works Progress Administration comes later, being larger than CCC, employing millions, building infrastructure, constructing post offices, schools, bridges, roads. The legacy being visible today, the buildings still standing, the roads still used, the investment being what benefits nation for decades. The Keynesian logic being that spending stimulates economy, that employment creates demand, that demand creates more employment. The theory being controversial then, being proven partly right, partly wrong, being debated still. You find yourself now at WPA construction site, summer 1935, watching men laying bricks, mixing concrete, the work being skilled, being supervised, being professional despite being relief program, the dignity being maintained, the quality being high, the distinction between work relief and charity being important psychologically, being what allows recipients to maintain self-respect, to feel they are earning money rather than receiving handout, the psychology being what Roosevelt understands, what makes New Deal different from Dole. The sound is hammers, saws, men calling to each other, the construction noise being music to unemployed ears, being sound of work, of productivity, of usefulness. The sensory experience being what photographs cannot capture, being what participants remember, being physical labour creating tangible results, being satisfaction that desk work sometimes lacks, being what builds more than buildings, being what builds confidence, community, capability. The federal programs proliferate. Alphabet soup of agencies, AAA paying farmers, NRA setting industrial codes, TVA bringing electricity to Tennessee Valley, SEC regulating securities, FDIC ensuring deposits, Social Security creating safety net, the flood of action being overwhelming, being experimental, being what characterizes first 100 days, first year, first term, the boldness being what people remember, being what distinguishes Roosevelt, being what creates modern liberalism, modern welfare state, modern regulated capitalism. The Social Security Act of 1935 is particularly transformative, creating old age insurance, unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children. The programs being modest initially but expanding over decades, becoming foundation of American safety net, being what prevents future depressions from causing equal suffering, being what provides security that 19th century capitalism lacked, being recognition that market cannot provide all needs, that government has role, that society should protect vulnerable, the philosophy being what defines mid-20th century liberalism. You stand now in rural farmhouse, evening of 1936, the family gathering around, someone reaching for switch, electric lights coming on for first time, the Rural Electrification Administration having brought power to farm, the transformation being profound, being what ends kerosene era, being what brings modernity to countryside, being what makes farm life more bearable, being what stems rural to urban migration, being investment that benefits agriculture, that improves lives, that demonstrates government can do what market won't, that rural areas deserve same amenities as cities. The glow of electric bulbs is revelation, the brightness being what allows evening activities, what enables reading, sewing, what extends productive day, what changes rhythms of rural life, the hum of refrigerator replacing icebox, the click of radio replacing silence, the connections to world being what electricity enables, being what reduces isolation, being what makes rural life more attractive, more sustainable, more connected to larger society. The Dust Bowl slowly improves. Federal programs teaching conservation, planting shelter belts, encouraging crop rotation, the top-down approach being necessary because individual farmers cannot coordinate, because tragedy of commons requires collective action, because environmental problems need systematic solutions, the intervention being successful, being model for future environmental policy, being proof that government can solve problems that market creates. The recovery is slow, unemployment falling from 25% but still being 15% in 1937. The progress being real but inadequate, the impatience being understandable, the critics being loud, some saying New Deal goes too far, others saying not far enough, the middle path being difficult, being what Roosevelt navigates, being balance between capitalism and socialism, between market and planning, between individual and collective, the American synthesis being what emerges. The 1937 recession is setback, Roosevelt having reduced spending, Federal Reserve having tightened money, the economy slipping back, unemployment rising again, the Roosevelt recession being what critics call it, being what teaches lesson about premature withdrawal of stimulus, about need for sustained support during recovery, about danger of returning to austerity too quickly, the mistake being corrected, spending being resumed, recovery continuing. The Supreme Court battles reveal tensions, conservative justices striking down New Deal programs, Roosevelt proposing court-packing plan, the constitutional crisis being what emerges, being struggle between elected government and judicial review, between democracy and constitution, between change and continuity, the resolution being compromise, court moderating, some programs being upheld, others being abandoned, the system working messily but working nonetheless. The labour movement gains strength through Wagner Act, unions being protected, collective bargaining being guaranteed, strikes being legal, the shift being what empowers workers, what creates middle class, what distributes prosperity more widely, being recognition that labour deserves protection, that workers have rights, that organising is legitimate. The philosophy being what conservatives oppose, being what creates bitter fights, being what eventually becomes accepted, mainstream, part of American capitalism. You stand now in late 1930s, the decade ending, the recovery being incomplete but real, unemployment being lower, production being higher, confidence being restored partly, the worst being past even if good times haven't returned, the transformation being evident, safety nets existing, regulations being in place, government being larger, more active, more involved, the changes being permanent, being what defines modern America, being what depression made possible, what crisis enabled. Remember those bank runs from 1930, depositors losing savings, institutions collapsing. Now FDIC insurance prevents runs, guarantees deposits, protects savings, the reform being what prevents repeat, being what maintains confidence, being what works so well that people forget why it exists, take for granted protection that previous generations lacked, the success being invisibility, being prevention that doesn't make news, being crisis that doesn't happen. The Dust Bowl migrants who fled west, who suffered in California, gradually finding stability, finding work, some returning to Great Plains where conservation practices are restoring land, others settling in California, becoming permanent residents, their children becoming Californians, the displacement being permanent for some, temporary for others, the integration being difficult but eventual, the prejudice fading as crisis recedes, as prosperity returns, as Okies become neighbours rather than threats. The breadlines gradually shorten, the Hoovervilles gradually empty, people finding work, finding housing, finding hope, the recovery being what everyone seeks, what everyone needs, what comes slowly, frustratingly slowly, but coming nonetheless, the patience being what depression teaches, being what recovery requires, being what people learn through years of hardship, through long struggle toward better times. Time advances, you finding yourself in 1940, Europe at war, America neutral but building military, factories hiring, shipyards expanding, unemployment finally dropping significantly. The irony being that war spending accomplishes what New Deal couldn't fully achieve, that Keynesian stimulus works on massive scale, that government spending can eliminate unemployment, the lesson being mixed, being that prosperity is possible, but requiring mobilization, requiring total commitment, requiring what peacetime democracy struggles to achieve. The transition to war economy is gradual, Lend-Lease helping Britain, factories retooling for military production, young men being drafted, women entering workforce, the transformation being what finally ends depression, being what creates prosperity, being what employs everyone, being what generates growth, the causation being clear, being what proves government spending works, being what Keynes predicted, being what conservatives resisted, being what war makes acceptable, even if New Deal didn't. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, brings full mobilization, depression ending completely, unemployment vanishing as everyone works, factories operating 24 hours, rationing replacing scarcity, overtime replacing unemployment, the problem shifting from too few jobs to too few workers. The reversal being complete, being total, being what demonstrates that depression was never inevitable, was always policy choice, that full employment was always possible if government committed resources. The war economy proves what New Deal suggested, that government can eliminate unemployment, that spending creates demand, that demand creates jobs, that jobs create more demand, the positive cycle being opposite of depression's negative spiral, the lesson being clear to those who see it, being what shapes post-war economic policy, being what creates consensus for activist government, for Keynesian management, for counter-cyclical spending, for full employment commitment. You stand now in evening of 1945, war ending, victory achieved, the nation being prosperous, employment being full, industry being robust, agriculture being productive, the contrast with 1933 being complete, being total, being transformation almost unimaginable, being what 12 years brought, being journey from despair to triumph, from poverty to prosperity, from collapse to strength. The veterans return to different America than they left, GI Bill providing education, home loans, the investment being what creates educated middle class, suburban homeowners, prosperous families, the spending being what prevents post-war depression, being what maintains employment, being what creates generation of opportunity, the wisdom being to invest in people, to build human capital, to enable prosperity widely. The lessons of Great Depression shape post-war policy, Bretton Woods creating stable monetary system, GATT promoting free trade, United Nations preventing war, Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe, the international architecture being what tries to prevent repeat, being recognition that depression was international problem, requiring international solutions, being wisdom purchased through suffering, being applied while memory remains fresh. It is late now. the story of Great Depression reaching its end, the narrative having travelled from 1929 crash through 1930s suffering to wartime prosperity. The journey being complete, being what shaped generation, nation, world, being what taught lessons about capitalism's instability, about government's role, about need for safety nets, regulations, interventions, being experience that created modern welfare state, modern regulated capitalism, modern economic policy. The people who lived through depression never quite trust prosperity again, the generation being marked by insecurity, by caution, by desire for security, by fear of return to hardship, the psychological scars being lasting, being what makes them save compulsively. Avoid debt, value stability over growth, prefer security over risk, being conservative in ways their children won't understand, being shaped by experience their grandchildren cannot imagine. The FDIC prevents bank runs, Social Security protects elderly, unemployment insurance cushions job loss, securities regulation moderates speculation, labour laws protect workers, the safety net being what prevents future depressions from causing equal suffering, being legacy of New Deal, being what Americans take for granted, being protections that exist because previous generations suffered without them, because memory of suffering drove reform, because pain taught lessons. The economic theories evolve, Keynesianism becoming orthodoxy, the belief in activist government replacing laissez-faire, the consensus being that government should maintain full employment, should stabilise economy, should moderate cycles, the philosophy being what dominates post-war era, being what creates prosperity, being what eventually faces challenges, being what gets questioned, being what cycles through acceptance and rejection as generations change, as memories fade, as lessons are forgotten. The Great Depression teaches that prosperity is fragile, that confidence matters, that psychology drives economics, that markets can fail catastrophically, that government has essential role, that safety nets prevent suffering, that regulations moderate excess, that intervention can help, that doing something is better than doing nothing, that bold action beats timid inaction, that experimentation succeeds when orthodoxy fails, the lessons being learned painfully, applied successfully, forgotten gradually, relearned eventually as cycles repeat. The story reminds us that boom becomes bust, that speculation ends badly, that leverage magnifies losses, that bubbles burst, that panic spreads, that confidence collapses, that recovery takes years, that suffering is real, that people matter more than statistics, that policy has consequences, that choices create futures, that wisdom comes from experience, that pain teaches what prosperity cannot, that memory fades, that lessons get forgotten, that cycles repeat because human nature doesn't change, that greed follows fear, greed follows fear through eternal rotation, from ticker tape optimism through Dust Bowl despair, to New Deal hope to wartime prosperity, the arc being long but bending toward recovery, toward reform, toward learning, toward progress, the journey being painful but transformative, being what created modern America, modern capitalism, modern safety net, modern economic policy, being foundation of post-war prosperity, being legacy that persists, being lessons that remain relevant, being history that echoes through present, being experience that shaped nation, being story that teaches, warns, inspires, reminds. The Great Depression fades now into history, into memory, into lessons that each generation must learn, into warnings that each era must heed, into patterns that repeat despite knowledge, into cycles that continue despite understanding. The eternal human drama of boom and bust, confidence and fear, prosperity and poverty, the story being incomplete, being ongoing, being what continues as long as capitalism exists, as long as humans pursue wealth, as long as greed battles fear, as long as markets rise and fall, as long as governments intervene or don't, as long as lessons are learned and forgotten, as long as history repeats first as tragedy, then as farce, then as tragedy again. Rest now, knowing that somewhere tonight markets still trade, prices still fluctuate, speculation still happens, cycles still turn, but safety nets exist, regulations moderate, interventions stabilize because Great Depression taught lessons, created systems, reformed capitalism, the protections being legacy, being what prevents equal suffering, being reason why modern recessions don't become depressions, being wisdom purchased through pain, being inheritance from those who suffered, being responsibility to maintain, to remember, to honour. Sleep well. The story continues beyond these pages, through decades since, through present moment, through future yet unwritten, the economic cycles proceeding, the human drama unfolding, the lessons being taught and forgotten and taught again, the patient work of building prosperity, preventing catastrophe, protecting vulnerable, maintaining security, enabling opportunity, the eternal project advancing through time, through experience, through wisdom gained from Great Depression, through memory of suffering, through determination that it never happens again, through vigilance that sometimes fails, through systems that sometimes work, through the patient measured progression of economic history, proceeding forward through time, through our own moment, through whatever comes next, the journey continuing, the story advancing, the cycles turning, the lessons echoing, the memory persisting, the protection remaining, the safety net holding, the regulations working, the interventions helping, the government serving, the capitalism reformed, the prosperity shared more widely, the security provided more broadly, the dignity maintained more universally, the progress being real even if incomplete, the improvement being genuine even if insufficient, the hope being justified even if challenged, the future being possible even if uncertain, the story continuing its patient advance through time, through history, through memory, through the accumulated wisdom of human experience, through the lessons learned from Great Depression, through the knowledge purchased through suffering, through the understanding that prosperity requires vigilance, that capitalism requires regulation, that markets require intervention, that society requires protection, that people require security, that dignity requires support, that hope requires action, that future requires wisdom, that peace requires justice, that prosperity requires sharing, that security requires caring, that civilization requires building, that progress requires working, that democracy requires maintaining, that freedom requires defending, that rights require protecting, that opportunity requires providing, that the patient work continues through generations, through decades, through centuries, through the eternal human project of building better society, creating more just economy, ensuring greater security. The story proceeding forward through time, through space, through consciousness, through memory, through dream, through sleep, through rest, through peace, through quiet, through darkness, through night, advancing steadily toward morning, toward waking, toward tomorrow, toward future, toward hope, toward light. Good night. End file wcm/home/claude/depression _part 3.txt and ancp/home/claude/depression _part 3.txt/m nt/user-data/outputs/depression _part 3.txt. The monuments to New Deal remain visible today, the post offices built by WPA, the national park trails cleared by CCC, the dams constructed by TVA, the infrastructure created by Public Works, the physical legacy being what lasts, being what modern Americans use without knowing origin, without understanding that Depression-era programs built roads they drive, schools they attend, bridges they cross, the invisibility being mark of success, being so integrated into landscape as to seem natural, eternal, inevitable. The achievement being overlooked, taken for granted, the way successful government always is. The social safety net endures, social security supporting elderly, unemployment insurance cushioning job loss, FDIC protecting deposits. The programmes being what prevents modern economic downturns from becoming depressions, being automatic stabilisers that work without conscious action, being systems that proved their worth in 2008 financial crisis, in 2020 pandemic recession, the protection being inherited from Great Depression, being gift from generation that suffered, being responsibility current generation bears to maintain, to protect, to improve for future. The economic understanding evolves beyond simple Keynesianism, incorporating monetarism, supply-side economics, various schools competing, but core lesson remaining, that government has role, that intervention helps, that markets need regulation, that safety nets matter, the debate being about degree not existence, about details not principles, being disagreement within framework that Great Depression established, being argument assuming need for some government action, even if disagreeing about how much, when, why. The Federal Reserve learns from mistakes, the aggressive tightening that worsened depression being recognised as error, the subsequent activism being what marks modern central banking, the willingness to expand money supply during crisis, to lower interest rates aggressively, to undertake quantitative easing, the tools being developed gradually, applied during Great Recession, preventing repeat of Great Depression, the institution being reformed by experience, learning from failure, improving through adaptation. By experience, the international architecture built after World War II, Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank, GATT, becoming WTO, all being attempts to prevent repeat of 1930s, to maintain stable currency system, to promote free trade, to prevent competitive devaluations, to avoid beggar thy neighbour policies, the cooperation being what depression's nationalism destroyed, being rebuilt afterward, being challenged now as memory fades, as populism rises, as lessons are forgotten. As each generation must relearn painful truths previous generation knew intimately. The political realignment created by depression lasts decades. New Deal coalition dominating from 1933 to 1980. Democrats winning most presidential elections, controlling Congress usually, the loyalty being earned through programs that helped, through intervention that worked, through government that served, the alignment eventually fracturing as memory fades, as new issues emerge, as conservative movement gains strength, as Reagan wins promising different approach. Being pendulum swing that American politics produces, being cycle that continues. The Great Depression's shadow lingers in cultural memory, the photographs by Dorothea Lange, the novels by John Steinbeck, the music by Woody Guthrie, the oral histories collected by WPA, the documentation being what preserves experience, what teaches subsequent generations, what prevents complete forgetting. The artistic legacy being as important as policy legacy, being what maintains emotional connection, being what makes abstract statistics into human stories, being what allows empathy across time. The economic theories that emerged, Keynesianism primarily, dominate post-war era. The belief that government can and should manage economy, maintain full employment, moderate cycles, the confidence being what characterises mid-century. Being assumption that crashes can be prevented, that depressions are relics, that modern economics has conquered business cycle. The hubris being evident in retrospect, being set up for next crisis, being forgetting of lessons that depression taught about limits, uncertainty, fragility. The stagflation of 1970s challenges Keynesian consensus, the combination of inflation and unemployment being what theory said was impossible, being what leads to monetarism, supply-side economics, deregulation, the conservative reaction being partly justified, being response to real failures, but throwing out good with bad, dismantling protections along with problems, the overcorrection being what happens when pendulum swings, when reaction becomes extreme, when balance is lost. The financial deregulation of 1980s to 90s repeats mistakes of 1920s, Glass-Steagall being repealed, derivatives being unregulated, shadow banking being allowed, leverage increasing, the amnesia being complete, being willful, being what happens when memories fade, when generations change, when lessons are forgotten, when hubris returns, when belief in market efficiency becomes dogma, when regulation is dismissed as impediment rather than protection, the stage being set for 2008 crisis, history repeating, patterns continuing. The 2008 financial crisis echoes Great Depression, the bank failures, the panic, the credit freeze, the plummeting asset prices, the unemployment, the foreclosures, the similarities being obvious, being what allows rapid response, being why TARP passes, why Fed acts aggressively, why stimulus spending happens quickly, the memory of depression being what guides response, being what prevents repeat, even if cannot prevent initial shock, the lessons being applied successfully, the tragedy being averted, the depression being prevented, the Great Recession being serious, but not Great Depression 2.0. The policy response in 2008, bank bailouts, quantitative easing, fiscal stimulus, draws on depression lessons, the willingness to act boldly, to experiment, to intervene, being inherited from New Deal, being what Bernanke and Geithner and Obama learned studying 1930s, being applied despite political opposition, despite ideological resistance, despite accusations of socialism, the pragmatism being what works, being what prevents catastrophe, being what justifies activist government, being what depression taught. The political response differs. Tea Party emerging, opposition being fierce, stimulus being smaller than needed, austerity being imposed prematurely, the 1937 lesson being forgotten, recovery being slower than necessary, unemployment remaining elevated longer, the politics being what limits response, being what prevents optimal policy, being what shows that knowing lesson and applying lesson are different things, that politics constrains economics, that democracy is messy, that even wise policy faces opposition. The pandemic recession of 2020 brings another test, another application of depression lessons, stimulus checks being sent, unemployment being expanded, Federal Reserve acting, the response being faster and larger than 2008, being more aggressive, being what prevents Second Great Depression, the pattern being established, being that modern government responds to crisis, that intervention happens, that safety nets work, that systems created during depression continue protecting, continue functioning, continue serving. The ongoing debate about debt, about size of government, about role of state, being continuation of arguments from 1930s, being same philosophical disagreement dressed in modern language, conservatives arguing for limited government, liberals arguing for activist state, the positions being recognisable, being eternal, being what democracy requires, being healthy disagreement within framework that assumes government has some role, that safety nets exist, that regulation happens, being argument about degree not existence, being what depression settled even if details remain debatable. The experience of Great Depression shapes not just policy, but consciousness, the understanding that markets can fail, that capitalism needs reform, that government has responsibility, that society should protect vulnerable, that security matters, that dignity deserves respect, that opportunity should be provided, that prosperity should be shared, the values being what emerged from suffering, being what defines modern liberalism, being what conservatives sometimes respect, even when arguing for different approach, being common ground even in disagreement, being legacy that transcends party, that shapes nation, that defines modern America. The comparison with other countries matters. European social democracies building larger welfare states, Scandinavian countries providing more security, American system being middle path, more generous than pure capitalism, less generous than European model, the balance being what Americans choose, being reflecting of culture, values, history, the choice being democratic, being what majority supports, being system that works reasonably well, that provides decent security while maintaining market economy, being compromise that satisfies most, even if pleases none completely. The future challenges loom, climate change requiring government action on massive scale, inequality growing beyond depression levels, automation threatening jobs, healthcare being increasingly expensive, education requiring more support, infrastructure crumbling, the problems being what require government intervention, being what market cannot solve alone, being what demands collective action, being tests of whether lessons from depression will be remembered, whether activist government will respond, whether society will protect vulnerable, whether prosperity will be shared, whether democracy can meet challenges of new era. The memory of Great Depression becomes more distant, the generation that lived through it dying, the direct experience being replaced by historical knowledge, the emotional understanding fading, the lessons becoming abstract, the warnings becoming easier to dismiss, the protections becoming easier to dismantle, the cycle being what worries historians, what concerns economists, what suggests that someday, somehow, similar crisis will occur because humans forget, because hubris returns, because markets boom and bust, because cycles continue, because patterns repeat, because wisdom is not inherited but must be learned through experience, because each generation makes own mistakes, learns own lessons, the eternal human condition being what it is. The Great Depression remains warning, reminder that prosperity is fragile, that confidence can collapse, that markets can fail, that suffering can be widespread, that government matters, that safety nets protect, that regulations serve purpose, that intervention helps, that society should care for members, that security is essential, that dignity deserves respect, that opportunity should be universal, that prosperity should be shared. The lessons being clear even if application is debated, being valid even if implementation varies, being important even if sometimes forgotten, being wisdom purchased through suffering, being knowledge earned through hardship, being understanding gained through experience, being gift from generation that suffered to generations that benefit, being responsibility to remember, to honour, to maintain. It is very late now, the story reaching its conclusion, the narrative being complete from 1929, crash through 1930s, suffering through New Deal recovery, through wartime prosperity, through post-war legacy, through modern echoes, the journey being long, being painful, being transformative, being what shaped America, shaped capitalism, shaped modern world, the Great Depression being what it was, great in magnitude, great in impact, great in lessons, great in legacy, being event that defines era, that shapes nation, that teaches generations, that warns future, that reminds humanity of fragility, vulnerability, interdependence, that shows what happens when markets fail, when confidence collapses, when systems break, but also shows what happens when government acts, when society protects, when people endure, when hope persists, when recovery comes, when lessons are learned, when reforms succeed, when safety nets work, when regulations moderate, when prosperity returns, when future improves, when democracy proves capable, when capitalism proves reformable, when humanity proves resilient, the story being complete, being finished, being lesson taught, being warning issued, being hope offered, being knowledge shared, being wisdom passed forward, being responsibility accepted, being future secured, being past remembered, being present informed, being eternal cycle continuing, being patient advance through time. Proceeding, being history moving forward through accumulated experience, through learned lessons, through applied wisdom, through maintained vigilance, through protected security, through shared prosperity, through collective effort, through democratic choice, through human determination, through resilient adaptation, through endless striving, through eternal hope. The Great Depression story ending now, fading into sleep, into rest, into peace, into quiet, into darkness, into memory, into history, into lesson, into warning, into wisdom. The patient work of remembering. Learning, applying, continuing forever, proceeding steadily through time, through generations, through centuries, through the long arc of human progress, bending slowly toward justice, toward security, toward prosperity, toward dignity, toward hope, the journey continuing beyond these words, beyond this moment, beyond this night, advancing toward tomorrow, toward future, toward whatever comes next, the story being incomplete, being ongoing, being yours, to continue, to honour, to remember, to apply, to maintain, to improve, to pass forward, the responsibility being eternal, the challenge being constant, the work being never done, the progress being possible, when wisdom prevails, when memory serves, when lessons guide, when history teaches, when democracy works, when capitalism reforms, when government serves, when society protects, when hope endures, when courage sustains, when determination persists, when humanity advances, patient, measured, steady, through time, through space, through history, through memory, through dream, through sleep, the story fading now, softly, gently, into night, into rest. Good night.